When I finally moved into my lake cabin, I thought it would be the beginning of a new chapter in my life, a place where I could wake up to the sound of birds instead of car horns, and spend evenings watching the sun dip behind the trees instead of fluorescent city lights. I had worked for years to make this dream come true, and every box I unloaded from the back of my truck felt like proof that I had finally made it. The air was fresh, the breeze coming off. The water was cool, and I could almost hear my shoulders relax as I set my things down on the porch, but that peace lasted less than an hour because the sound of heavy footsteps crunching down my gravel driveway announced the arrival of trouble. 3 HOA board members, led by the infamous Karen, marched toward me, clipboards tucked under their arms with the smugness of people who believe they own not just their homes, but everyone else's too. Karen didn't even bother with a hello. She pointed at my cabin like it was an eyesore, and in a shrill voice demanded to know what business I had being there. She claimed the property was part of the association's shared land and insisted that I had no right to move, and I blinked for a moment, trying to process her audacity, because I had signed every paper, had the deed notarized, and even triple-checked with the county before I bought the place. This was my cabin, my sanctuary. Yet here, she was flanked by 2 equally entitled neighbors, waving a stack of so-called compliance documents, as if they carried the weight of law. She jabbed one in my direction and told me to sign immediately or face legal action. I calmly asked her to explain why she believed the land belonged to the HOA, but she cut me off, talking over me and rambling about community preservation fees, maintenance dues, and visual harmony requirements, all while ignoring the fact that my cabin had been here for decades, long before their HOA was even created. The other 2 board members nodded along, adding their own threats about fines and forced removal. I felt a spark of anger, but I held it in because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't just the new owner of the cabin. I had purchased far more than they could imagine. I had spent months researching the land ownership in this area and discovered that the original developer who sold them their home still owned several parcels of land, including the one the HOA had been falsely claiming as community property. Those parcels had quietly gone up for sale, and I had swooped in, buying not just my cabin, but also the land underneath their very houses. In that moment, as Karen stood there trying to intimidate me, I wanted to laugh, but instead I simply nodded and told her I would review her papers later. She smirked, thinking she had scared me into compliance, but deep down I knew the day was coming when the truth would shatter her arrogance, and the HOA would realize that their supposed authority was built on nothing more than false assumptions. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday evening in the community hall, a building they treated as their fortress of power, and I decided that would be the perfect place to reveal the truth. The days leading up to it were filled with smug glances and whispered gossip from Karen and her board. They strutted through the neighborhood bragging that they had confronted me, the outsider, and were preparing to strip me of my squatter cabin. They even spread rumors that I was facing eviction. Within weeks, I could almost feel the neighbors' pitying stares when I walked by, but I stayed silent, carrying groceries to my cabin and watching the lake ripple under the golden sunset. I let them build their confidence higher and higher, because I knew the higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be. When the evening of the meeting arrived, the hall was packed. Karen sat at the head of the table, with her ever-present clipboard and a glass of water she held like a scepter. She opened the meeting with a dramatic speech about how the HOA existed to protect property values, enforce standards, and ensure the safety of the community. She smirked in my direction as she painted me as a trespasser who had brazenly moved into land that didn't belong to me. She promised her audience swift action, fines, and even the possibility of forced removal. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding along as if her words were law. But as I sat quietly near the back, I felt no fear, only patience, because the time for silence was over. When Karen finished her speech, I slowly stood and walked to the front, carrying a thick folder of documents. She laughed nervously, asking if I was ready to sign their compliance forms, but her laughter died when I laid the folder on the table and opened it for all to see. Inside were deeds, property maps, and county records, each stamped with official seals, proving not only that I owned the cabin, but that I also held the titles to several surrounding parcels, including the very lots under which Karen and her fellow board members' houses stood. The room fell silent as I explained how I had purchased the land from the original developer, how the HOA had been operating under false assumptions for years, and how legally They had no claim over my property or any authority over me. Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air as neighbors leaned over each other to read the papers the two board members who had stood beside her on my driveway shifted uncomfortably, their smugness evaporating as they realized their own homes technically stood on land I now owned. A man in the back raised his hand and asked if it was true that the HOA had been collecting fees under false pretenses. The murmurs in the room grew louder, turning from support for Karen to suspicion, anger, and betrayal. People demanded answers, accusing her of misleading them and using fear to control the neighborhood. Karen stammered that it was a misunderstanding, that they had only been trying to protect everyone, but her voice shook. With panic, the respect she had clung to for years slipped away. In minutes, the police officer who had been called earlier in the week to remove me happened to be at the meeting off duty. He stepped forward, glanced at my documents, and confirmed aloud that everything was legitimate. I could see heads turning toward me now, not with pity, but with respect and curiosity. I looked at Karen and her board members, and instead of gloating, I simply said that I had no intention of abusing my ownership or throwing anyone out, but I would no longer tolerate harassment, intimidation, or fabricated rules from people who had no authority. The neighbors applauded, and Karen shrank in her seat, staring down at her useless clipboard. As I walked out of the hall that night, the cool air felt lighter than it had in weeks. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, and I realized this battle had never just been about property. It was about dignity and truth. I had moved to the cabin for peace, and in standing my ground, I had won not only my freedom, but the respect of those who now saw through Karen's lies. Sometimes the sweetest victory is not in humiliating your enemies, but in letting the truth strip away their false power until all that remains is silence.